That old passive audience, which used to be at the receiving end silently of whatever survived through the selection process enforced, in the case of political news, by politicians and journalists, is a thing of the past. Now it's an active audience. They don't just read what we write, they critique it, they select it, and they are responsible in no small way for maximising or minimising the readership of any given item by tweeting a link, by liking it on Facebook, and so on. In the case of the Reddit website, they literally vote a story onto the front page. And so content is evaluated, not outlet by outlet as it used to be, where audiences develop general impressions of which TV networks or radio stations best appeal to their tastes, but item by item. Item by item. Individual news stories do not now enjoy the protection simply of being judged by a single editor to be worthy of inclusion in the list of newsworthy things that happen today. More and more, readers themselves decide what's newsworthy. The monopoly on deciding what constitutes news is no longer held either by editors or by politicians. And of course, now that individual stories are left to succeed or fail on their own terms, their authors, like protective mother turtles, try to give them the best possible chance in life by making them as eye-catching and easy to read as possible. And so stories about thrilling crimes, or the broken-hearted ex-girlfriends of footballers, or action-packed accounts of political confrontations tend to dominate in the most read lists. The proliferation of new ways in which to consume news has led very naturally to the fracturing of old audiences. Genuine news junkies have no need to watch the evening news anymore, as they've been trawling news websites all day and already have more detail than a 2-minute bulletin is likely to cough up. They know genuine scoops will spread through the system smartly enough. So, shorn of these more demanding viewers, the network packages news as entertainment, because that's what tends to grab the attention of those who are not tuning in studiously to eat their veggies civic discourse-wise. This is what tends to be called dumbing down, or the coarsening of political debate. Another way to describe it, I suppose, would be democracy. And isn't that one of democracy's most annoying elements? People with whose assessments one disagrees, getting a vote anyway. The opinions of the lazy and ill-informed having just as much sway as the engaged and industrious. It's easy to draw the conclusion, almost irresistible really, that political discourse is getting stupider. But for a number of reasons, I think we should be cautious about doing that. First, I'm not sure that there's any convincing evidence that the actual proportion of people who are diligent about informing themselves on public policy issues has actually changed much. The naked eye tells you, and certainly Lindsay Tanner adduces much evidence to support this impression in his book, that the amount of lightweight political coverage has increased. But the amount of political coverage overall has itself increased so extraordinarily over a short period of time that one should be wary of leaping to conclusions. Access to in-depth journalism has never been better, whether it's thanks to new online entrants in specialist areas, or better access thanks to podcasting and the abolition of geographical boundaries online, to content producers working in states and countries where the reader doesn't live, or broadcasting in inconvenient timeframes. Without wanting to toot the ABC's trumpet excessively, I'm constantly surprised and excited by the work my own colleagues produce and the extent to which the internet makes it easier to find and absorb, whether it's Fran Kelly's interviews, which you can go back and catch online if you missed them earlier, or Marius Benson's relentless attentiveness on news radio, or Stephen Long's innovative economics reporting, or Mark Colvin's utterly engaging snippets and links on Twitter, or the battalions of new perspectives every day on the drum. There's depth to be found everywhere. Think tanks like the Lowy Institute with its excellent interpreter blog, or the IPA or the CPD, or indeed my host tonight, the Sydney Institute, now function as publishers. So do universities through sites like The Conversation. Individual bloggers like Grog's Gamut lend a valuable fresh perspective to political matters, and new websites with strong readerships by area of interest, like Mamma Mia, interpret politics in a way that appeals to its readers. There are organising websites helping us to track all this stuff. It's a funny old morning in my house when I don't visit Breakfast Politics, which provides not only a daily digest of political news, but an invaluable archive and reference. If you're a foreign policy wonk, you might well complain that your area of interest doesn't warrant enough serious column space in various of the daily newspapers in Australia. But can you really argue that you have less to read now than you had 10 years ago? I think one should be careful too with the assumption that the mass audience of yesteryear was necessarily a more engaged one in the field of politics. Was there ever a merry band of Herald Sun readers eagerly drinking in page-long treatments of superannuation reform? Or has this reader revolution simply made clearer to us what was the truth all along, that lots of people always bought the paper for the sport and the telly and not much else? Obviously not while I was working in newspapers, but you know. Thirdly, I think we should be very careful indeed about assuming that there's only one correct way to learn about politics, and that's to sit down with a cup of coffee, a Madeleine, and the Australian Financial Review. Matthew Baum, an academic at the JFK School of Government with whom I met in Boston, demonstrated in his fascinating book, Soft News Goes to War, that the spread of political discussion from straight broadsheet newspapers and newscasters to magazine-style formats and celebrity-infested chat shows doesn't necessarily mean the end of serious engagement. He charted, almost as a hobby, I think, the degree of public attentiveness to the 1978 Camp David Accords between Israel and the PLO, the 1993 Oslo Accords between Israel and the PLO, and the 1995 Dayton Peace Accords between Bosnian Serbs and Muslims. Now, though more network TV stories appeared about Camp David, historically the most significant of the three, Baum found that Americans were more engaged with Dayton and Oslo. Why? Well, perhaps because Norman Schwarzkopf had done a high-profile interview about Oslo with Regis Philbin and Kathy Lee Gifford, or perhaps because Saturday Night Live ran a popular satirical series poking fun at the Dayton Accord. Soft news treatment of politics rarely satisfies purists or practitioners, but it often suits consumers who have no patience for prescriptive ideas about how they should best learn about politics. After Walter Cronkite's death in 2008, Time magazine asked online readers who they felt was now America's most trusted newscaster. 44% of respondents selected Jon Stewart, the late-night comedy channel host of The Daily Show. And yes, I did visit him. Stewart doesn't even claim to be a journalist, but his Lansing analysis is cultishly popular on the left, just as Fox News commands the right. I suspect this technological revolution doesn't change audiences so much as identify and stratify them, and give each of those audiences far greater access to the sorts of things they like than they ever had before. This all sounds a bit Pollyanna-ish. Maybe it's because I'm an optimist. And maybe it's because, in the end, there's not much sense in arguing over something that is, thanks to the evolution of technology, singularly beyond all of our control. The market is evolving to empower the consumer, the reader, the voter. The old gatekeepers are losing control, and arguing against this progression is as pointless as arguing against the sunrise. Politicians yearn for the old ideal of a passive mass audience because that made life easier. Media proprietors yearn for the good old days too, because the same vain illusion under which politicians always lived, that is, the firm and, I suspect, erroneous sense of confidence that 100% of Sydney Morning Herald readers have just read and enjoyed the faithful news account of your excellent microeconomic reform proposals, could be spread to advertisers who went to bed at night just as restfully assured that readers were feasting on their double-page spread on winter warmers. But mass audiences are not realistic anymore. How could they be? In the new environment, it's a bit insulting to think they ever will be again. In a world full of people who are so different, why would there ever be a single mass audience for any kind of news, now that the artificial barriers that once dictated one have so utterly dissolved? This is how audience fragmentation works. As viewers and readers learn how to find the stuff they like, the old gatekeepers, whose job it used to be to decide what people would or should like, are increasingly redundant. That's why all this hurts so much. Redundancy always does. But as we've always glibly assured previous victims of the open market, retraining is always an option. In the media's case, it means learning how to work with smaller audiences more productively. And this isn't as sad as it sounds, bean counters. Small audiences can be immensely profitable if you know a lot about them. The new model is perhaps not all that different from the old one. An element of upfront payment and an element of hustle. In the old model, you paid a small price for the newspaper itself, and you exposed yourself in perfect good humour to the implicit risk that you might feel more like buying a fridge by the end of reading the thing. That was the hustle. Your partial attention was rented on spec to advertisers. And sometimes it worked, and most of the time it didn't. But those were the odds, and advertisers took them. These days, the upfront payment is a work in progress. The hustle, though, is a new model. Rather than surrendering your partial attention as part of the trade, you're much more likely from now on to be offering something much more valuable. Information. Perhaps you'll give your postcode, or your age, or your email address. Perhaps your use of a news website in and of itself will leave a trail of golden identity crumbs. Are you unusually interested in articles about cars? Do you pounce on items about housing prices? Or perhaps, most profitable of all, you might let on that you're expecting a baby or renovating your bathroom. These identity crumbs are the key to your profitability as a reader in the new model, I suspect. Pitching an ad at 1,000 people whom you know are likely to be in the market for a stroller might be more valuable to Mr. Bugaboo than an ad in a paper read by 200,000 people. You still pay, you just pay in different ways. Now, the United States experienced a much more savage media sector downturn than we did in the closing years of this century's first decade. And yet, everywhere I travelled in the States, there were ambitious new startups learning to serve smaller audiences better. The Voice of San Diego, one of dozens of hyperlocal news sites, which experiments with handing reporters over to answer questions posed by its readership. ProPublica, a Pulitzer Prize-winning investigative unit funded by philanthropists, handy, which distributes its work to other news organisations at no charge. There are entrepreneurial sites devoted to long-term... I'll start that again. There are entrepreneurial sites devoted to long-form journalism, like The Atavist. There are open government lobby groups like the Sunlight Foundation who crowdsource valuable work on scrutiny of government. There's not enough time to run through everything I visited, but if you're prepared to step outside orthodox media formats, there's a lot going on. For politicians, though, the urgency is in the here and now, and the potential to communicate difficult arguments to a large audience. The most legitimate concern about today's fractured media marketplace is that we no longer have a town square, a place where we're all on the same page at the same time. A moment outside grand finals or particularly gripping episodes of MasterChef at which a large chunk of Australians are all thinking about the same thing. This is a fabulously complicated problem to which I think the only sensible answer is consistency, hard work, and the sort of innovation that we haven't thought of yet. At times, I think politicians get spooked by this freewheeling babel of media with which they tangle every day. They're worried about getting a run in the media, to the extent that getting a run becomes the aim in itself. This is a phenomenon about which Tanner writes with conviction and very chillingly. Tony Blair called the media a feral beast in his vivid speech on leaving politics in 2007. And fear of the beast is a common response among politicians forced to tangle with its ever-multiplying tentacles. Urge to conquer the beast or to sate its appetite is another. I think the Rudd government's constant, almost manic efforts to conquer the beast with constant activity, constant announcements, were ultimately quixotic. Political journalism of 50 years ago, in which a Prime Minister might have got round the whole country just by asking 8 favoured journos around for a fireside chat, is no more and will never return. Politicians will go mad if they think they can satisfy demand in the same way these days. They still crave control of the message, some sense that they're prevailing against the beast. And I say to them on this front, abandon ship. You cannot control this, not anymore. Use the energy for something else instead, like finding ideas that you can stick to. Authenticity is a quality people will recognise no matter what medium conveys it or how many.
The ABC's online political commentator Annabelle Crabb speaking there at the Sydney Institute. Next up, does gender change the focus or style of leadership? Is the boardroom, the cabinet room or the corner office becoming overtly feminised? Or does an unconscious bias in the workplace force women to adopt male models of leadership? The Australia and New Zealand School of Government convened a panel of high-achieving women, including former Democrats leader Natasha Stott-Despoja and Victoria's former top cop Christine Nixon. Wrangling the conversation was the ABC's Virginia Hausiger.
Wendy, you've been at the forefront of a lot of legislative change in Australia to pave the way for more women, not only to get into Parliament, but business, boardrooms. And yet you wrote, again in the Griffith Review just recently, that these policies and guidelines haven't delivered as much as we hoped they would. They're not sufficient to deliver women leaders. Why?
Oh, I wish I had a pat answer for that, but I don't. I think it is a very complex thing. I think... if I go back to my original feminist passions of education and family planning, we call it fertility now, let's call it family planning. We've achieved in education by getting women through tertiary education, girls finishing high school, etc. And I think we imagined that's all we had to do and change would be linear and incremental because that's what we saw in men's careers. If we were looking, and we probably weren't looking that hard, we're probably doing what Katie says, getting through the day. I think with family planning, what's one of the really interesting things, that is the perfect case of the wicked problem with the exquisite dilemma. The wicked problem was to enable as many women as possible to manage their fertility, because that was one way that you'd be sure you could be able to manage your career. What we didn't realise as the demographics shifted, I was born to an 18-year-old mother. My first child was born when I was 27, and her last child was born when she was 26 in that family. She had one many years later, but for the sake of the exercise. My daughter had her first child. I had my last child at 32. She had her first child at 32. Think of that demographic shift in a 40-year period. It is truly astonishing. So we end up down this other end with issues, which around IVF, assisted parenthood and so on. And so all the things that we'd educated and planned for in careers, when men are getting careers, women have deferred many of their major life decisions further down. So we have lots of dilemmas that we didn't anticipate. We just couldn't see that future.
So are you suggesting that women, when at that point in their career when they really ought to be taking up opportunities that would lead to leadership in their late 20s and 30s, they're busy perhaps having their first child, getting married, doing those sorts of things?
They were diverted. I mean, if you look at medicine and you wonder why you don't have many women obstetricians and gynecologists, because you don't get into a college till you're about 32. 32, you've got other things happening in your life. So we haven't found that rhythm where people can progress through. Now, the good news is we live 7 years longer than men, so we do have time to collect and pick it up. And we have to keep saying that, and we just have to work out how we do it. But I really don't think we had any sense of the future we were creating. We were dealing with the issue then, and now we have to think about that. And that's a wonderful problem to have.
Yeah, look, I think the other piece here is having watched, a lot of women come into policing from, the few of us who were there when I started, and then I think, there are about 44% of the applicants now to join policing, and of course we've now, I think New South Wales got about 36%, Victoria's a bit behind, but the fact is we got a lot of women through, and we've got them through, I have to say. The fact they had children, but it took a lot of work and a lot of thinking about how did you make the most of that. And I'm still not convinced that we've actually figured that out at all. And the work structures, the part-time, the flexibility that allows women to continue in their careers and have babies. I mean, it always seems to me a bit of this revelation that women have children. It's like... did we not get this? And why have we not solved it? And I watch policing solve it. I mean, very male-dominated occupation, but you took, women assistant commissioners in New South Wales. One has 2, the other has 3 kids. New South Wales has a number of women senior positions now who've had a number of children along the way, and, they are able to achieve. And I think we still need to pay a lot more attention to that kind of flexibility to get rid of the attitudes. And I think the other process, which I can't help but take this chance to say, is our methods of selecting women for positions needs to be much better than it's ever been. When we changed the systems in New South Wales after the Royal Commission, we started to see women just pour through because the blokes had sat on the selection panels. They looked and went, "You don't look like me, you're not getting the job." And no matter what you did, you couldn't get it. Once we got the women to apply, which is important as well, we started to see them coming through. And I think, there's still a lot of organisations, and particularly partnerships, and particularly some corporations who haven't figured that out yet. You need better selection systems to get even women through the door.
There's no doubt there is a problem of people employing in their own like and boards employing in their own like. Katie, you haven't come up against that, though, at all, really, have you?
Come up against what?
Well, any sort of sense of discrimination being female in your political career?
Yeah, well, I was mistaken as a tea lady once when I was the acting chief minister. I was about 100 months pregnant and sweating at the time, and I was late to the meeting in Sydney, so I still haven't really...
Did you have to stop and say, "No, actually, I'm the acting chief minister"?
Yes, it was awkward. I walked in and the chair of the Ministerial Council said, "We're not ready for morning tea." And my heart just sank, and I thought, this is going to be terrible. Anyway, I did get on with it, and everyone was very apologetic. But I've had things like I had 2 babies in the last electoral term, and aside from not handling my fertility very well, I did. I felt very much the responsibility to have me balancing that and working very publicly. I think going to Natasha's point of sending a message and trying to encourage the next generation of female leaders. And there were times when I was breastfeeding those babies, in cabinet, when I wished I wasn't being a trailblazer in that regard. But I had comments, I was told I was a part-time mother and a part-time minister, and those things go to your core and they send a message, and they were public statements made about me. They send a message to women that if you want to have children and you want a career, then just think about it, because you're going to face these kind of comments. So I have to say I've been very lucky, and in a way the male leaders have sort of assisted me and sort of challenged some of those biases. But I have to say they're there, and you just have to confront them and move on, is my view. But I've had them. They've been at the fringe, yeah.
Natasha, have you had times when you have wished that you weren't a trailblazer? You just wish it would all go away?
I'm sure there were times when it all seemed just a little too hard. I love Katie's comments. I remember one of the best things when I went on a delegation, I was breastfeeding my son, and someone rang up from the Parliamentary Liaison Office and said, "Could we have your breastfeeding schedule?" It's just like, it doesn't work that way. But having said that... That's it. I always admire, I remember poor Kirsty Marshall when she was ejected from Victorian Parliament, and all I could think of was, when I had my first child, I just thought mine was never that discreet and sweet and lovely. There's no way it wouldn't have happened in the Senate. But anyway, look, I think that by virtue of going into a profession, male-dominated or otherwise, and you recognise that maybe you're doing something that other people haven't done before, that you accept that responsibility and you're proud about it. Yep. And I'm a real believer. This is the one thing in terms of where you say, does gender inform how you act, or should it make a difference? Well, it's always made a difference to me, not specifically in how I've been judged or perceived or what have you, but because as a feminist, I always knew and learnt that my responsibility was not to attain power for the sake of it. It was about doing what you could for the women who followed you and for other women in your community. So, but I was imbued with that, from my mum. So there's a strong sense of that. And perhaps in return I have high expectations of other women, fairly or unfairly, trailblazers, be they the Prime Minister, or other female leaders in other professions and politics, and that is, I do expect that. So it's brilliant to be considered a trailblazer or a role model, but let's look back and acknowledge what some of those women have done, whether it's the Joan Kerners or the Cheryl Kernos, the Carmen Lawrences, and obviously Julia Gillard and even, Julie Bishop. I mean, you think of 30% doesn't mean a lot when we still have women being pitted against each other in the debates in the way that men in leadership or other contests never seem to have that same. So I think, not very, very proud of it, but I share Katie's, I can look back now and laugh at some of those experiences.
And I'm sure there are many women leaders that can't or don't laugh at some of the things that have been put to them, again through the media, because of their femaleness. But you've both raised, or all of you have raised, the issue of fertility and having children. For women who don't have children, as we know, and the Prime Minister's a key example, that can be used against them because somehow they are an unnatural woman. And it's got to be said, some of the slogans that have been used lately to describe our Prime Minister have been quite extraordinary and have left many of us with our mouths open. But I just want to raise an article that was written by Malcolm Farr, a very well-known political commentator who works for News Limited, who wrote a piece in the journalist magazine, the Walkley magazine, so most of you wouldn't have seen it, but I thought it was fascinating. It was titled "She Who Must Be Flayed." And he actually talked about how his own horror at the treatment of the sexist treatment of the Prime Minister. And he went on to say, and I'll just quote this, and he said in public and in the media, he went on to say, it's as if, he said he's convinced that there's a male core in politics and the media who, and I quote, privately list her gender as a disqualification from holding the top job, the top leadership. It's as if some believe a law of nature has been upturned. Now, I think there's some interesting truth in that. Why is it, though, that here in the 21st century we're still struggling with that notion that a woman in that position, a top job, who might be childless, that somehow it's unnatural?
And doesn't really deserve it.
If she had kids, we'd be criticising the amount of time she wasn't spending with her family. I mean, sometimes, arguably, women in public life can't win. And having said that, whether you're a mother or no mother, I think mother guilt and women's guilt's pretty corrosive. But look, I love it. The idea that Malcolm Farr is a born-again feminist is just... I might show him a few newspaper clippings that I've got from... well,
it's interesting. It is a discussion currently in the press gallery, more and more so, and it's coming, interestingly, from senior men.
And I hope it should be. And I mean, I've listened to some of the comments they've made about Julia, and being a single woman in a as I was, and without children in a leadership position, I've had all of the ridicule about that. And then they've added a few more things to it as well. But, it is about a way that they try and get at you. And I think in Julia's case, I think I heard someone call her unengaged. Now, what does that mean? And it means, she's not married to her husband. It's like, it was just... And in a sense, I watch, males leap about the place, in hardly any clothes and...
like bathers.
Looking like males.
Might want to narrow that. No,
you know what I mean? But publicly. And I think it's about ridicule. And that's what this is all about. It's got a bottom line, and ridicule is really hard to deal with. And as long as you don't let it get to you, you're okay. But for me, it was ridicule around, my husband's left me at least 20 times so far. Like, God, and I must have run off with all the lesbians in the country. And...
That's why you weren't paying attention to your job.
It's true, And so it's just the way they try and get at you, and I think, I've watched some of these comments about the Prime Minister, and I think time's up. Deirdre Mackin wrote a great article in the Financial Review the other day, and she basically said, listen up, you lot. We've had enough of this. You can't suggest the Prime Minister should be killed, which is what people were suggesting last week, and nobody did anything about it. And you can't suggest these kind of things. It's just not on as a way of behaving in public. And I think it's about time we had a bit of, as she described herself, Mum giving you a good slap and saying, get on with yourselves. Stop behaving.
I agree completely. It's get over it. Julia Gillard is the Prime Minister. And when I look, what we should be focusing on you know, whether you agree with her policies or not, is the fact that she, as Prime Minister, is managing the most difficult parliament that any Prime Minister has ever been given the job of managing. I mean, she is negotiating with independents. She doesn't have the luxury that, you know, her predecessor Kevin Rudd had, or John Howard had, or any of those male leaders had. She has to negotiate with all of these independents to actually get any agenda through, whether it's hers or theirs. And, you know, I mean, I'm biased, of course, but I think she's doing an incredible job, and we've just got to move on. She's the Prime Minister and she's managing the country.
So it brings into question the fact that we assume that the natural habitat of leadership is male. And we are challenging that by doing it. I see it in business all the time. I see when there's nearly a critical mass in a corporation and suddenly they disappear. And there's no leadership roles for them. And suddenly the direct report looks like Sydney University rugby team with the CEO. And you think, how do you break this through? And it can be so capricious. So that critical mass of people, which, you know, it is so crucial, but it's got to be so solid in so many layers. And it's got to have women who are brave enough to speak out.
And to fight back.
And to fight back, and it's got to have women who are prepared to support other women leaders, even if they don't like them.